Hello everyone, I'm Justice Graves and I'm currently running to be a member of the Narragansett Regional School Committee here in Templeton, Massachusetts, and today's video is going to be about the ethics, or at least my personal ethics, behind why you should support special education programs. This video is going to be under the title in the playlist of Outreach and Transparency, which you can clearly see from the title screen of it being blue with that nice side description, so hopefully that is helpful. This will be in that, so you can watch those videos. Those are generally just more broad-based topics. This is going to be more broad-based, and this is actually in response to this particular video is in response to the conversations about special education that came up in some of the school committee meetings, and I just wanted to sort of forthright talk more in depth at the end of this video about that opinion that I had in the first school committee video that I had gone over and done, that review, the first one in that playlist, and also to just go over what the general philosophies that can go into it, because here's something that I came up with when I started to look into special education more. That became sort of more of a frustration for me. There are a lot of different disability activists, there are a lot of parents who are very active in the community of special education and special education reform, and one of the interesting parts is that they aren't really certain about the foundations about why they support this. Obviously, they love their children, and that's in and of itself a justification for why they would do these things. Many of them obviously becoming disability activists because of, different siblings and different members of their own family or nuclear families that need assistance through different IEP programs and different types of interventions. However, what's interesting is that there's all of these chants online about, equity. There's all these chants about justice. There's all these chants about, this is human rights. And that's all well and good, but it doesn't get into the basic logic of why we do these things. Like, there's a reason why in society we have handicapped parking spaces. I know these may seem like two very different topics, but the idea of just supporting people with disabilities in a concrete and specific way goes fully into special education in a way that I don't think many people are willing to discuss. And so, like I said, this is very relatable to that concept, and so I'm going to be talking about that, and we are going to get into it. I have a little bit of a slideshow prepared for this, so I'm going to switch into that right now. This slideshow is only about 3 slides long, so this is just for talking points, and then I'm going to transition back over to opine back again on what I had talked about in that first specific school committee meeting. So let me just get this set up and then switch. Where are you? Here we go. Alright, so the ethics of supporting special education using some modern utilitarianism and my own thoughts. So I'm going to use some of the pillars of utilitarianism to explain why I support special education. However, utilitarianism does have certain issues that I don't necessarily support, but there are some pillars that are very important, and as utilitarianism is an actual ethical school of thought, is an actually developed way of looking at the world, I thought that this would be a good way to sort of go through within certain logical steps why we do these things, instead of just chanting about these concepts that have become much more popular with regards to justice and equity that I don't think a lot of people understand, and that, truthfully, as I understand them, are not really the applicable schools of thought if they have any logical application to this. Even in the specific topic of special education. I don't know how it got to this point, but it has. Now, within special education, when you use utilitarianism, disability advocates, they are not happy when they hear that, because some of the ideas that go behind utilitarianism are the idea that one of the more common old ways that a utilitarian would discuss disability is that those with disabilities should, at all costs be cured. There's this whole conversation about should they be born or not. We're not going into that discussion. That is a family-by-family discussion as to whether or not people wish to deal with that or not. In general, children should be born, so I don't understand why. I don't want to go into that rabbit hole, and that's not the purpose of this discussion, and that is a completely different school of thought from, for example, even supporting handicapped parking spaces, to the concept of we should fund special education programs. And I want to make this clear right now before we even hit 5 minutes on this video. You support, no matter what, even though it's state law, You should support special education programs, that's my personal opinion, and that students should have all of the access and support that they can to be successful, whether or not they are or are not on IEPs. So I just want to make that extensively clear. And so we're going to just get into this. So one of the pillars about utilitarianism that I wanted to discuss about that is applicable is that utilitarianism sees disability as a strictly negative thing. Now I want to sort of modify this pillar. I don't personally believe that. I believe people who, whether you have cerebral palsy, whether or not you have Down syndrome, there are actually people who, through their special education, have developed their independent spirits in such a way that they are truly benefits to society with different ideas and concepts that the average person such as you or I would not have. And so I wouldn't say that disability is a completely negative item. Older utilitarianism says that some modern contemporary utilitarians actually sort of believe the position that I propose, that there are positives, there are pros and cons to this. But in general, the pillars that are most important is that those with disabilities should have their happiness maximized. Utilitarianism in general is on the principle that you should maximize happiness and welfare and minimize suffering. And in my case, suffering is lack of education that I'm applying to the concept of suffering over here. Let me see. Here we go. Over here. And this concept of utilitarianism is an approach that's sort of inherent to altruistic tendencies. If you didn't see what my personality type was, it's, one of the more altruistic types, liking to solve things, liking to do things for the greater good. And so these concepts are very appealing to me, and I use them in my own thought structure in going through this. But again, I'm just modifying that at the top. I don't necessarily see it as not that disabilities are a negative thing, that there are pros and cons, that there are ways to weigh that. And then in general, again, utilitarians want to get rid of or alleviate all disabilities. However, more modern utilitarians actually go into this option that if you're going to cure or you're going to assist, you have to weigh both options. And so, of course, there are no cures for Down syndrome. There are no cures for cerebral palsy. There are none. And so the only option that a utilitarian would suggest is to assist, and that the ways of assistance must be weighed against the pros and the cons. The way that they weigh the pros and the cons I don't agree with, because they go based off what is the direct value of a person, sort of treating them in a very direct way, such as like how one would go into a bank and deal with their portfolio, or go into go through the stock market and, deal with their portfolio. I don't necessarily agree with that school of thought of doing that. I believe human beings cannot be used as a means to an end. So in that regard, I don't like to see it like that. In some interesting respects, a lot of different disability advocates who use the equity principle don't understand this, but that's essentially what they do sometimes, is they put these human beings into positions where, unfortunately, they may be put as basically a tools as a means to an end, which in many different philosophical schools of thought are very inappropriate. And just as another warning going through this, very quick conversation as to why I support special education, or like my thoughts around special education. This video isn't meant to be an entire philosophical in-depth discussion. This is supposed to be very quick. So if you're gonna ding me on, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about this, I'm not going to. This is basically just my opinion for the public to understand, and the very bare bones conversations that I'm full-throttedly willing to happen, full throttle willing to have on this subject, just to sort of create that atmosphere. It is because of this, and when you actually understand the concept that there is no cure, your option is to assist. When you take out that, students are not meant to be tools, what you get is obviously the correct conclusion that you should fund these programs. This is just a very, quick way to sort of go through that. Anything else that goes with utilitarianism in the subject tends to have an interestingly, not dangerous, but very inappropriate turn for the worst when it comes to how this sort of plays out. So I'm going to switch back and switch out of this, and I'm just going to continue to speak. So if you didn't know, the reason why I wanted to bring up, my reasons for why you support with regards to, because, students are in distress, etc., what we just sort of went through. The situation really is that it's not just the responsibility of, anyone locally to support special education. It's the responsibility of the state, and the state recently has decided that it has not done a lot. There's been a lot of conversations, but there isn't a lot of actual action being done when it has come to reallocating how special education funds are done within each of the different communities and municipalities in the state of Massachusetts, and that has become a big burden and is going to become a big burden on fiscal year 23. For right now, because of fiscal year 22 and with the different CARES funds, we believe that this won't be a huge problem, but there are a lot of different concerns going forward when it comes to the situation of special education and how those costs are increasing, and how costs are increasing, how the state hasn't really been acting with that. And so, of course, with the rest of the school, the school committee has sort of expressed that they are concerned about this, and so hasn't the superintendent, expressed concern that, now that I have more of the knowledge, that it is very likely that I will probably sit in one of those two seats. The election has not happened yet. That I expressed that would be one of the things that I 100% agree with them on in terms of dealing with that particular situation, in terms of how to approach it and finding different ways to approach it, in the spirit of what Mrs. Matson had said with regards to why don't we investigate different things that are going on, with respect to what Dr. Kosova has said, like why don't we go and, not why don't we go, but, basically the legislature keeps just talking about fixing the issues, talking about fixing it, and then just never doing it. And, just funding different other programs that they're interested in not really putting in the effort to funding special education the way that they should. And I think that really needs to get pointed out a lot more explicitly. And in that regard, I hope to be a unified voice with them on that particular topic. And if not a unified voice in the topic of that the spending needs to be increased from the state level, and hopefully find a unified voice that there needs to be, explicit conversations with the legislature and more and more, and hopefully getting more and more townships and different school districts to back up on that. Although I know a lot of them are, but obviously finding a better way of getting that message across that forces the spotlight in such a way that, the State House can't ignore that anymore. Capitol Hill can't ignore it. They really do need to act, especially in regard to what has happened with the increases in education during this pandemic year. So that is the video. That is it. Like, share, and subscribe if you like this, and hopefully this was interesting for you. I really appreciate you listening. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.